Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, my name is Solby Lim, and my pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the Communications Associate for Women Cross DMZ and co-coordinator for Korea Peace Now. And we are so excited to be co-hosting tonight's program with GYOPO. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items to go through. If you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute. And please also introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, so we can know who's in the room tonight. We will be recording the moderated conversation, so please be aware of this. And I think a notification also popped up, but we will stop recording when we move into breakout rooms later. A quick rundown for the evening is that we will have a moderated conversation, then we will move into breakout rooms, and then all come back together for the last 10 minutes of the program. So this is actually the first intergenerational healing and learning program of 2025. We started this virtual public educational series last year to critically understand the intergenerational trauma stemming from the Korean War and other US forever wars. A lot has changed since then, and we want to acknowledge the weight of what we're currently experiencing as the Trump administration continues attacking our communities and very ways of living. In Korea, Yoon and his supporters are attacking democratic institutions, courthouses, newspapers, and more. It can be overwhelming and exhausting. And in gathering here today, we want to name this chaos and acknowledge what we've been feeling in response. But we know that these crises are not new. And this also means our response and our resistance are not new either. The people from Turtle Island to South Korea have always mobilized against these attacks through protest, organizing, building collective knowledge, and creating community. In gathering today, we ground ourselves in our community. We open this space as one to take care of ourselves and each other, to reflect, tell stories, and build a better world together. Korea Peace Now was born out of a campaign founded in 2019 to educate, organize, and advocate for an end to the Korean War and establish lasting peace on the Korean peninsula. Our US-based grassroots network has now grown to have hundreds of members across the country. We are multi-generational Korean Americans, humanitarian workers, faith leaders, anti-war activists, and more. We are diverse, but held together by the principle of mobilizing to end the Korean War, grounded in intersectional feminism, democratizing US foreign policy, and contributing to lasting peace globally. If you would like to join us and support our work, please visit our website, koreapeacenow.org, which we will also put in chat. Although we're often referred to as, quote, the Forgotten War, the Korean War inaugurated the US military-industrial complex, quadrupled spending, and was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, with more than 4 million killed in 3 years, mostly civilians. The topics brought up tonight can bring a lot of heavy emotions. While this is a political advocacy and organizing space, we encourage folks to find and join other support groups and communities that center conversations around trauma, healing, identity, and more. Please remember to take care of yourselves, to take breaks as needed, practice generosity in listening and learning, and acknowledge that we all come from different backgrounds. And we are very excited to have GYOPO co-sponsor this event with us. So I will now turn it over to GYOPO.
Hi, my name is Tahi Kim. I use she, her pronouns. I was adopted from Korea in '88 and grew up in Minneapolis. I'm now based in Los Angeles, and I've been making documentary films around the adoption experience for the past 7 years. Filmmaking has been really pivotal to my adoption awakening, giving me space, exploring these landscapes that have historically been very taboo to me. And so I've been in LA for 5 years and found Kyopo to be an enriching and crucial community for me to be in as a Korean adoptee, grappling with my Koreanness. So I had, heard about Kyopo and attended some film programs like the Namjoon Paik Moon is the Oldest TV documentary screening. But also what really hooked me was a book club meeting conversation around Hong Kong's The Vegetarian. Being in a group of like 30, Korean American, mostly women, 99% women, having these critical conversations was really energizing. And so that's when I knew I wanted to get more involved. Um, Kyopo's mission is to build a robust intergenerational and intersectional community through collectively organizing free educational programs on arts and culture. We organize these programs to interrogate the conditions we are in, to hone our critical faculties, connect cultural producers working across fields, shine light on repressed histories, and center peoples marginalized in our very own diaspora, all in the service of better understanding ourselves so that we can together build a world where we actually want to be in. Please stay connected with us to learn about more programs, and you can sign up for a mailing list through our website, kyopo.us, which we can link in the chat. Um, so now I'll turn it back to Anna, over to Anna. Anna Kook is a multilingual, award-winning reporter who seeks to bring Asian faces and voices to mainstream media. And so we're so excited to have her with us. And now to you, Anna.
Thank you so much for that intro. This is my first event with Korea Peace Now in Kyopo, so it's such an honor. So I'm gonna moderate the conversation for the next 50 minutes. Just to get started, I kind of want to frame the conversation first. Transnational adoption arguably wouldn't have started or grown to what it has become as South Korea became the largest exporter of babies overseas without the Korean War and the US presence on the Korean peninsula. And many of you, if you weren't familiar with adoption stories, probably encountered adoption stories in the media first through reunion stories that are, really emotional and powerful. But that often is not the full story. It's not the story of all adoptees and actually doesn't represent what most adoptees go through. And a lot of people think transnational adoption stories are a thing of the past. It's a past issue, but the Korean War, as a lot of people forget, is still ongoing. And so there is a very direct relationship between the Korean War and transnational adoptions. And it is so relevant today with how it relates to the current world order and the fact that there is still an investigation ongoing into the adoption industry with past military dictatorships in South Korea. And so adoption agencies have also not been held accountable yet. So this is still a very much ongoing issue, and we'll talk more about how it relates to the current political climate in South Korea as well. So that's just to get started with our conversation. I would now want to introduce our two panelists. So to begin with, Deann Borshay Liem. She is an award-winning filmmaker who makes documentaries on topics including war, family, and adoptee identities. She's really just an OG and vanguard in this storytelling space, especially when it comes to adoption stories and just telling diverse Korean narratives. Um, and I'm sure she's been an inspiration for a lot of us here. And Meejin Seol, she is joining us all the way from South Korea. Well, maybe some of you are in Korea. We're all in different time zones. But she is an aspiring documentary filmmaker and a community organizer who is currently playing Nori, which is traditional Korean music, folk music in Seoul right now, which has been a large presence in the recent protests for impeachment. So, and since this panel is about adoption stories, both are adoptees who came to the US from Korea. And the goal of this conversation and this panel is that hopefully by the end of it, we have a better understanding of how Meejin and Deann harness their unique narratives and experiences to empower their work, their art, and community around them. So without further ado, I'm gonna just get into the conversation and start with our first question. And I want to start with Deann. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal story, adoption story, and how it relates to the Korean War, your perspective on it, and how is that reflected in your work?
Sure. Thanks, Anna, and hello, everybody. Thanks first to Korea Peace Now and GYOPO for hosting this event and for Meejin to have a conversation together. This is wonderful. I have a bit of a cold, so I apologize if my voice sounds funny. Um, yes, well, let's see. I'm adopted from Korea. I was adopted actually, well, I was born in Korea, and as most of you know, the Korean War armistice was signed in 1953. I was born 4 years later, and adopted at the age of 8 by a family in Fremont, California, and grew up in a predominantly white community with a white family. And when I was adopted in 1966, everyone thought I was a Korean War orphan. People had a sense that there was a war that had happened. They didn't know the details about the war, and they didn't know that an armistice had been signed. And they all thought that and assumed that my parents had died during the war, and I was orphaned as a result, and therefore needed to be adopted. So I grew up kind of as an all-American kid, and the way I dealt with my adoption was basically to forget everything about Korea and essentially develop total amnesia about the first 8 or 9 years of my life. And it wasn't until I was in college that I started having flashbacks of my childhood, which led me to search for my family. And through that process, eventually reunited with my Korean family and discovered that I had not only my Korean mother, but brothers and sisters and a very large extended family. And through that process, I also learned that I had been switched with another child and that my paperwork had been falsified basically falsified, and that I had been switched in the adoption process, and nobody actually realized that I had come to the US in place of another child. And so my work and really my activism has been deeply inspired by and influenced by my adoption history. And when I made my first film, First Person Plural, it really was an attempt to get at the truth of who I was and what my history was. And I think over the course of making that film and many other films, came to realize that the Korean War was a pivotal origin point for Korean transnational adoption, and that it influenced who I am and my Korean family and my identity. So I've gone on to make several films about Korean adoption and the Korean War, and continue to work on another project about Korean adoption. It's an obsession. I can't seem to stop. So,
Well, we need more of it.
you'll
Um,
get.
did you did you want to share a clip of your work?
Sure, sure. Well, I think some of you might have seen. So I've made two films about my own personal story, First Person Plural and In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee. Both films were on PBS, and then I made a third film, Geographies of Kinship, which is about four adopted Koreans and kind of Korean War and post-war history, and how their stories are integrated into contemporary Korean history. And I'll share this one clip of the story of Estelle Cook Sampson, who was born during the fighting in 1951 or 52. Her adoption papers, she has different birth dates, but she was born before the armistice was signed, and ended up in Busan, and then was sent to Seoul, where she stayed at the St. Paul's orphanage in Seoul, and then was adopted by an African American family. And this is her story of her meeting her adoptive father at the St. Paul's orphanage.
Well, the day that I met Sergeant Cook, I remember that day so vividly. It was a spring day, beautiful day. And this particular day was the first day I ever went upstairs to the auditorium. They had a lot of soldiers, and a gentleman asked me to come sit on his lap. He gave me a package of gum. He was really a very kind-hearted person. For whatever reason, that particular day, Sergeant Cook chose me. During the adoption process, I was allowed to go to the military installation and live there.
Wherever the US military was, you see camp towns. Camp towns were these special entertainment districts, and they're only for the US military. Prostitution was technically illegal, but widely available in the camp towns.
The military prostitution that became the kind of signature activity of the camp towns was condoned and even regulated by the South Korean government in order to maintain good relations with the US forces.
That's an excerpt from Geographies of Kinship, and I think it's the film goes from the Korean War through the 70s and 80s into the period of military dictatorships, where when the numbers of Korean children sent overseas increased dramatically through the 1980s and then into the IMF period in the 1990s. So it's available if people want to watch it, I think, on Canopy. So that's it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I'll ask more questions in a bit, but I do want to get to Meejin as well now. I know, Meejin, you also have a song that you want to share as to introduce yourself. But yeah, I guess for you, Meejin, as an aspiring documentary maker, can you share your perspective on how your personal story has affected your work and your perspective on the Korean War?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do the song later because I feel like after
Okay. Okay, no worries. We'll ease into it.
ease into it. Yeah, I'm actually really happy that you started with Deann because Deann, one of Deann's films, First Person Plural, was a film I watched it was a moment of politicization for me. I watched it with a group of Korean and Chinese adoptees when I was in college. And I actually think Deann's film library, I think it's a library now, has really laid a foundation for not only exploring intersectionality of adoption, but also for building a collective. So many folks on this call in the chat are talking about Deann's films. And I think that there exists actually now a collective historical consciousness within a certain community of mostly Korean American, activists, academics, and I don't know, many other circles about the connections between adoption and the unended Korean War because it's not over. And I actually, maybe this is wrong, but I think, Deann, you might be one of the first filmmakers to include adoption in a film about like the Korean War as a part of Korean history. And so for me, after watching Deann's films, I shifted from, at that time, from feeling like I was an outsider, like not Korean enough, not Asian enough, um, to understanding my story and my location, both like physical, being in the States, but also political, as like a an early, yeah, in the early stages of my organizing. But at like I shifted my thinking as a lesser known but really important part of Korean American and also Korean history. And with that spirit, I moved to New York, got engaged with progressive Asian communities, a group called CAV, that was organizing tenants in Chinatown in the midst of gentrification. And yeah, I organized with them for almost a decade and decided during COVID to move to Korea to spend time with family, learn language, deepen my drumming practice of pungmonori, and also work on a heart project film. That everything, I've progressed on everything except for the film. And I think also kudos to Deann for making two personal films, because I think living, right, like living the experience while also like making a film about it is really, really hard. So Joanne, I'm actually wondering if you can cue up my my thing, but yeah, this is like a really super rough draft. It's also my first time sharing it publicly. I already want to make edits to it, but yeah, this is what I've been doing and working on.
What does reunion mean? To return, reclaim. Return to land, reclaim self. Who would I have been if I had stayed in Korea? Knowing what I do now, would I be the same person? Returning is not about going back to living how I would have lived. Returning is about bringing my whole self and learning that returning to land, building relationships, learning language, and playing pungmonori are all radical acts of both healing and resistance. We were not supposed to come back, but we also were not supposed to be sent away in the first place. Being able to speak less Korean than my 5-year-old niece is not a deficit. It is evidence of division. But being on the present land, drumming, learning about Korean movement culture, participating in impeachment protests with my pungmope, and my baby steps toward learning language. 윤석세기 탄핵까지 힘써봅시다이. 국민의 힘 해체하라이. Adding my own unique flavor and finding pleasure along the way is an act of resistance, self-love, and has been transformational.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. That's beautiful. I mean, we all get really insecure about showing our work, so I totally get it, but I thought each line was so powerful. I'm curious why you chose Pungmulnori as your journey back to Korea and how it relates to your story.
Yeah, pungmonori is, I actually was first introduced to a changu when I was in high school. I became friends with a Korean American who approached me. I was a transfer student. It was like my junior year. She approached me because she thought I was a Korean exchange student because I was wearing like pink shoes and like a rainbow belt. And so she started talking to me in Korean. And her mom was like had been training to be like a muyang, which is like a traditional Korean dancer. And so she also like played changu. So she took me to a class with a bunch of like toddlers when I was in high school at like 7 in the morning on a Saturday after we had like stayed up all night watching Korean dramas together. So that was like a brief introduction, and I remember really like connecting and loving that practice. And there was a group in Seattle that was talking about the history of Pungmunori, how it had been used in like these democratic uprisings in Korea as a tool during the rallies to energize people, but that it was also like an agricultural practice that, you know, folks had used like for a really long time. And so I think I really connected to that history. Like it felt like a connection. Being able to drum felt like a connection to me, to Korea, to like my heritage, or whatever, that I was in the process of trying to like rediscover. And so there was a group in New York when I moved to New York in 2011 that it was a queer and trans and ally group of Asian Americans who were playing Pungmunori in the Manhattan Pride Parade and also the Lunar New Year for all contingent, which was an LGBTQ contingent that played in the Lunar New Year and in Manhattan, Chinatown. And I think yeah, those experiences, I think it was really, really special for us as like specifically queer and trans people to be able to come together and play. And I think I guess I never really thought about my adoption like in connection to Pungmul. It was more about like my Korean identity. And we kind of, there's like a joke here in Korea that like Koreans who grew up here, they may have played like in elementary or middle school, or been like a part of a group in college, possibly, right? Like a club. But most people don't play and don't really have connection to Pungmunori, but then they meet all these overseas Koreans and like everyone is really into Pungmunori and they're like surprised. So I think, uh, yeah, so part of my reason for coming here was I wanted to deepen my drumming practice and like meet a teacher in a group that both vibed with my politics, but also who I could play with. And I feel like I've found that. I've been really lucky to find that. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I now want to ask you both a little bit about what Korea peace means to both of you and how you would define that. So Deann, I know I watched Crossings and you know the whole film, it's about an act that seems so simple as, you know, a group of women peacemakers wanting to walk across the DMZ, but you know, they're met with so much controversy. They have to navigate a lot of, you know, difficult situations. So for you, what does, you know, peace on the peninsula mean? And how do you, you know, stay focused with that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Well, first, I just wanted to say, Meejin, I love your sample. I love your lines. I love the line about the language and that it's not a deficit not to be able to speak Korean as good as your niece, young niece. And yeah, I can't wait to see it and look forward to it when it's completed. Korea, and it's such a good question, Anna, and I actually don't know how to answer it. I do remember when I was working on Crossings and the moment when Trump was scheduled to meet with Kim Jong-un in Vietnam, in Hanoi, and I was coming back from dinner and hearing this news and thinking about the possibility that there could actually be an end of war declaration or some kind of process by which, you know, some kind of process toward normalizing relations and actually ending the war. And I remember feeling this possibility of like relief and this weight being lifted. And I thought about, you know, all the decades of activism and all of the generations that preceded us who have been working for peace and trying to bring this conflict to an end. And it reminded me also of another film that I made with Ramsey Liem called Memory of Forgotten War. And one of the protagonists in the film, James Chun, when we interviewed him, he was commenting on or reflecting on Madeleine Albright's trip to Pyongyang when she went in 2000, October 2000, to meet and met with Kim Jong-il. And at the time, there was a potential for a summit between Clinton and Kim Jong-il. And I recall Mr. Chun just having this kind of expression of, wow, you know, it's going to happen. The war is going to end. It's finally going to end. And he was someone who had taken, for like a 3-year period, he had taken like up to 35 families from the US to North Korea every month to reunite these families with their families in North Korea. And so I think he, you know, it was very poignant just listening to him posit this idea that there could be peace and what that might mean. But, you know, I guess in my work, I've just been so consumed with kind of drawing out stories of this quote, forgotten war. And so it's a good question. I mean, I think ultimately what peace means to me is that the Korean people would be able to determine their own fate without the intervention of the United States or other foreign countries, and for Koreans to be able to decide for themselves how peace would unfold. And I do think about what it might mean in relationship to adoption, since we're talking about adoption. You know, I think there's a way in which we still don't know everything about our own history as a collective community of adopted people. In my new project, I was interviewing a Korean adoptee whose mother is Korean and whose father is an American serviceman. And she has paperwork that indicates that she was from the North, that she was born during the fighting before the armistice, and that as a baby, she had been brought to Busan during the January 4th evacuation. And I was actually at the DMZ at that Dorasan station looking over, there's an observatory where you can look into North Korea. And she was looking across into North Korea and wondering if she had family there. So I think there's these kinds of questions about our own adoption history that we may not really be able to understand or know until there is some sort of peace and end to the war, that we can actually are able to learn about, you know, what happened to women in North Korea, and were there children that were born to foreign men in the North, and what happened to them, and etc. So anyway, I'm rambling, but that's what I was thinking about with your
No, yeah. I mean, there are so many untold stories of family separation that we have yet to know. And yeah, thank you so much for your answer. I mean, Meejin, do you have anything to add or go off of that?
Yeah, I think just really briefly, well, I think I'm really excited that Deann saw my piece and said that she liked it.
I love
I
it. Hurry up and finish.
Yeah, I've been talking to her about this project for like 8 years, 9 years. So it's been a really long time. I think for me, Korea Peace, or you know, as we say and move in the thing like peaceful unification or tongil, to me is really about connecting. And I think as adopted people, we some folks have said this before, but like as adopted people, we know we have the best idea of what it means to be divided, because that has been our lives. And those of us who have reconnected with Korea, either the land or language or people, either in the countries that we were sent to, right, um, uh, or back in in Korea, I think we know what it's like how violent and unnatural it is to reconnect. And so peace, I think peace is a word that I don't know, I think of like doves and like sky blue colors, and like really nice things. And I actually think like in order to get to peace, I think there's actually quite a bit of, like guilt and loss and grief that we have to kind of like make our way through, in order to kind of like find those moments, right? So when I think of Korean peace, I do think of like, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to be able to like take the KTX train from Busan up to Pyongyang or all the way up to like Baekdusan, right, in North Korea. Like that would be really, really cool. And for families to be able to meet each other more like regularly after being divided for so long, not just in these like super emotional, intensified government oversighted or, yeah, like meetings with like that are like arranged by the government. And so I think, and for me, I think as a queer adopted person, for me to be able to show up in spaces fully as my like queer adopted, disconnected, funky language person, to be welcomed in that space as I am, and cared for. So yeah.
Yeah. So I also realized I never kind of introduced myself in the beginning of like how I relate to this conversation. But I was gonna say like, I've been reporting on the impeachment protests with historical context, and I also made a short film or report on a biracial adoptee and his journey in Korea to find his birth mother. Having said that, I guess from what I've seen in the media, it's just, and in South Korea right now, the political climate, as I'm sure all of you know, where the word feminism and tongil is so weaponized and controversial. I'm curious, Deann, how do you get funding and support to continue your work and to tell your narrative? I mean, I also understand it's not easy to do that when um, in the mainstream media, it's kind of seen as controversial. So yeah, I wonder if you have any advice for other, aspiring filmmakers or artists here on how to stay true to your storytelling and get support.
Yeah. Well, funding, it's so hard. I mean, I spend so much time fundraising. And I used to think that fundraising was something different from filmmaking, but I've come to recognize that what the work that I do in fundraising is part of the filmmaking process. But it's a way of consoling myself that all the time I'm spending in fundraising is part of the whole process. But funding, has historically been really challenging, and is even more challenging currently. There are gatekeepers at every stage of filmmaking, from media arts organizations that support development or production, to film markets, to fellowships, festivals, distribution. And in many ways, today, if your film is not true crime, a film about a celebrity or a scandal or sports, it's really hard to get the attention of streamers or distributors or funders. So it's challenging. And I think, many of you have probably been keeping up with the news, along with many other things. Elon Musk and Trump and allies are targeting PBS and NPR, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is a taxpayer-funded entity that supports many independent films through organizations like the Independent Television Service and the Multicultural Alliance, which has funded most of my films, as well as PBS stations nationwide. So, I think the platform that I, distributed my films on, which is public television, is really at risk today and may not be around, or in any way that we know of it, now. So So it's depressing. But having said that, I think independent filmmakers have always been creative about both fundraising, funding, and distribution. I think that I always think about audience when I'm making a film, like who do I really want to reach with this particular film? Films are not for everybody. My films are not for everybody. I always think about my adoption films are really very specifically first for adoptees, adopted people, adoptive families, anyone affected by adoption. And I really think about that when I'm making the film, and then in distribution, really try to focus on how to reach those audiences. And similarly with Crossings, I mean, Crossings, the usual funders that funded my prior films would have nothing to do with Crossings, in part because of the political content. And it was really only through the support of foundations that aligned with the film's themes, like the Compton Foundation and individual donors and a social what do you call it, a Kickstarter campaign, that I was able to actually fund the film and get it out into the world. And in distribution, really just again focusing on who is the film really for. It was really for peace activists, women's organizations, Korean peace activists, Korean communities, faith-based groups, veterans organizations. So we really, focused on reaching those audiences. Not getting it on Netflix. It did eventually get on PBS, on through the World Channel, but it's not every film needs to be on Netflix or want to be on Netflix or Hulu or whatever. Although it'd be great, but it's not. There are ways to reach our audiences if in creative community endeavors that I think can be really meaningful and important.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That was very honest. And it's a hard situation to navigate for sure. And I think going off of that, in my storytelling, the adoptee that I follow doesn't reunite with his biological mother. And I chose to stick with that despite there being some push for a reunion story. So I want to ask you, Meejin, what do you think the media appetite is for non-reunion stories, and why are other stories, important to tell? Because from my research, I found out that less than 20% of adoptees reunite with their biological families. So yeah, do you want to share your perspective on that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a few films that have been made recently, including yours. But there's three filmmakers who have made story. One is called Between Goodbyes by Joda Moon. Another is called it's there's actually a French title, but I don't know the French title, but it's called Patience Sweetheart by Sophie Breder. And there's also another one called those are both adoptee made films, and then there's another one called K Number that's made by a non-adopted Korean person. And I think all three of those films there's like traces of reunion, like people are either searching or um yeah, or they have like been in reunion and it's telling the story of reunion. But one of the Sophie's film, actually, Patience Sweetheart, she's going through the process of like grieving her adoptive mother who has passed away and like going through her house and getting rid of stuff. And so I actually am seeing those are not like, big those films are not going to be on Netflix necessarily, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. Um, but I I think I think folks are actually being able to like move away from like feeling like they compelled to tell the reunion story. Like in K Number, they talk about, it is following this woman who's interested in reunion, right? But the film actually focuses more on like the challenges that she faces, like the institutional challenges, right, by her agency, by different like government organizations along the path to get there. And so I think and then it raises questions actually about like the ethicality, right? Like how ethical was this adoption in the first place? And so I don't know. I've never gotten funding. I have yet to start that part of my filmmaking process, Deann. Um, so I guess we'll see how it goes. But I also feel like this film is going to be for a very particular audience um, of folks. So.
Yeah, I love that. Just stay focused.
Right.
Mhm. Deann, do you want to add?
Well, I was just going to say, reunion, I think there is obviously kind of dramatic quality and emotionality, I think, in reunion stories that Korean media and Western media have sort of tend to, be drawn to. But I think for our communities, we've learned a lot from reunion stories. It's through our stories of reunion that we've learned that adoption transactions have been highly unethical and problematic and sometimes illegal or, abusive. And it's how we've discovered that we've been switched or that there have been lies in our adoptions. So I think the stories are still important. To both community building and knowledge building and organizing. And I know that for the people that I'm following in this, the participants in my current film, through their searching and meeting their family members who were in the US military or who are African American or Black German or Vietnamese Amerasian, they're making really amazing discoveries about US military deployment globally and how that has left sort of this, these very human relationships between military and local populations, and charting this trajectory of US global deployment overseas. So anyway, I think there's a lot that we're still learning, and through kind of the whole search and reunion. But obviously, reunion is not, the reunion is not an endpoint. It's really the starting point for a very long and complex lifelong journey. I was adopted nearly 60 years ago, and I'm still learning new things about my Korean family and building relationships with members of my family and learning new things about myself and trying to grow along the way. So there's much more beyond the reunion, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really important to tell. And I think from what I've seen, the media landscape is just evolving, and people have seen the reunion stories and they're open-minded to find out more. And I'm a big believer of if you kind of give people a story, they will take it if it's a good story. And so I think I've been pleasantly surprised on YouTube. We've been able to reach a wide audience that's, not just restricted to adoptees or Koreans. So that's been a pleasant surprise. I mean, you both have talked quite a bit about community building, and I want to, talk about the concept of family and how to build community. I guess, how do you both, find strength in your personal stories to um, build a community, and what the concept of family means to both of you? Meejin or Deann, do you want to start?
Yeah, I wrote some notes um about this question. Yeah, I mean, I oh, family. Um to me, I think again, like as a queer adopted person, I think about family obviously like outside of the biological sense. Like I think in queer community, we talk about having chosen family, either because our families have like rejected our queerness or rejected us for our queerness, right? And so we've had to like find other means of um, other ways to survive. But I also think about I've been thinking a lot recently about this idea of like people wanting to like build a family of their own. I think especially within queer community, but also our many of our adoptive families, right? For various reasons, they wanted to like adopt a child from Korea, and um, I think this idea of like having a family of your own is actually kind of like a settler mindset, right? Because like having a child of your own also means that you are most of the time breaking another family apart in order to do that. And so there's quite a bit of privilege in that process. Um, and so I've been thinking a lot about like what does alternative family building look like, especially again for a queer community, to yes, for us to be able to build family, right? But maybe not in the kind of like typical sense of like two parents and then like one having like a child who is somehow either biologically related to them or brought into the family through adoption.
Deann, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, I think building on what Meejin just said about kind of family, the traditional family, I think what I've thought about, what I've learned through adoption is really to question or rethink the role of the nuclear family in our society and the idea of exclusivity in the adoption exchange, in the question of whether an adopted child belongs exclusively to the adoptive family, foreclosing any relationship with their original families, which is kind of the model of adoption that, I grew up in. And in many ways, it's as if children are commodities. And I think kind of this focus on bringing this child into a nuclear family in this exclusive arrangement has really been harmful, to the mothers who relinquish the child, to the adoptive parents, and to the adopted individuals. So I think, reframing and questioning the nuclear family and to challenge that, and looking at extended families or different ways of building communities and families, not only in raising children, but also in taking care of ourselves and each other as we grow older, as I grow older. I think that we should look at kind of what those alternatives are. So I agree with Meejin.
Yeah, I guess we have time until the breakout room for one more question. I guess going off of that, something that I've noticed through my work, I also do a lot of reporting on Gaza and the pro-Palestinian movements worldwide. I see so many comments of people being like, "Can I adopt these children?" A lot of people think that's a way of saving, people in Palestine, and their way of helping. And I've also seen comments, when I speak about adoption and what it's cost for adoptees, people are angry that adoption is being portrayed in this evil way when they think it's a righteous thing. So, for you, Meejin, how I see your Palestine pin. So I'm curious how your identity as an adoptee kind of extends to other areas of activism, especially when it comes to your participation in pro-Palestine movements.
Yeah, I see someone in the chat said, if you want to save kids, maybe don't blow up their homes from
Or
Alex.
push your government not to do that. Yeah.
Right. And I actually I've been involved with my drumming group in the Palestine Solidarity protest here in Korea, where we yell at the Korean government, but we also march past the US embassy and chant at them that they're being complicit in genocide. And I gave a speech last summer and talked about that. I said like people could send money, right, to support families. A lot of Palestinian families are doing fundraising right now for a very wide range of things. Or they could petition their government to stop sending the bombs used to destroy, that child's home or kill all of the generations of that child's family, right? Or to maim that child so that they need care in the first place. But people would actually rather spend money to to own that child, and take them away from, like as adopted people, I think we understand very well, um, being taken from our land, from our culture, from access to our language. And, um, like I think during the Korean War, and immediately after the signing of the armistice, there were images of like poor orphans and American soldiers. Some of, right, some of those images Deann actually showed in her clip. Excuse me, I have some in my throat. Like, those soldiers were doing things like giving chocolate in those to children in those images. And I think, what I talked about in my speech is images of those same soldiers doing like horrific things like torture, degradation, mass killings of Korean civilians, were not portrayed in the media. And the way, because of social media now, we are seeing some of those images coming out of Palestine, right? And so like there is no way to paint Israeli soldiers as like doing any type of good, because we're seeing the atrocities live. And yeah, I think that's a difference with what was happening in the Korean War, because we were seeing what media chose to filter and share with the public. So yeah, I have a lot more to say on that, and maybe maybe I can talk about it in the breakout group if people are interested.
Yeah, for sure. Deann, did you want to add anything before we break into the rooms?
Well, I guess just that, in times of war and natural disasters, there's this tendency to swoop in and kind of scoop up the children. And we've seen it in, of course, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Haiti, elsewhere. And I think we have to be vigilant about protecting the rights of families to keep and raise their children. And yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why these stories, adoption stories, are still so relevant and important to tell, for people to be knowledgeable of, what family separation and adoptions do to everyone around them. So yeah, I think we're ready to break out into little rooms where we can have further conversations. But thank you so much for having this meaningful conversation.